to be changing. The things that might have been taught in churches or practiced in churches when I was growing up, we're thinking 30, 40, 50 years ago for some of us in this room, they are not necessarily the same values that we're seeing in people today. And I noticed this change and this trend, but until this book came out, I never really had the data to back it up. And this is from the Barna Research Group, and they are known for doing pretty good quality research in terms of their numbers, statistics, and getting a good cross-sample. This was published in a book called Unchristian. And what this is doing, it's looking at the differences in values and behaviors for the baby busters, age 23 to 41, versus older adults. And what you're looking at here is things like cohabitation, living together before marriage. 59% of the younger group would say that's acceptable versus only 33% of the older adults. Go on down here to sexual thoughts or fantasies about someone. 57% acceptable versus 35%. Sex outside of marriage, 44% versus 23%. You go on down here to looking at pornographic images, 33% versus 19%. Same-sex relationships, 28% versus 13%. And then I almost have to laugh as I get down into the last one, using the F word on broadcast TV, only 7% think that's acceptable. It's like, okay, up here we're all right with the sexual stuff, but sometimes I think what we find with Christians is we tend to, maybe when one area gets out of control, we get real self-righteous and overcompensate in another one, and that's just a theory as to why that statistic might be there. But I bring this to your attention just to say that we need to be aware that as people are coming to you, that the values that may have been taught to you growing up and that you may have embraced in your faith may be very different from others who are coming along behind us. And we need to be aware that part of what we are dealing with is a difference in a value system. Now, I find working with people in general, no matter what the issue, that most folks cannot even tell you what their values are if you ask them. And so one of the things we'll do in the therapy process is we'll work on values clarification. Some of the symptoms of addictive sexuality, and I want to go through this list because these are some of the things people may come to you with. This is how it may look when it walks in the door. One of the things you might see in them is they might be going further with a sexual experience than they intended. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard people say, well, I was only going to kiss her. And then it went further. I was only going to do and put the boundary up here, but the boundary gets crossed no matter what. So going further with an experience than was intended is one of the signs that has become unmanageable. Let me sidebar here on that for just a moment. The term addict or the term sex addict is not something that people are very fond of embracing. Don't get in a fight with people over that one. They can call it whatever they want to call it. Yeah, it doesn't matter to me what label they put on it. I just want them to deal with the problem. And the word that seems to fit and connect with a lot of people is the word unmanageable. And when it gets to a point of unmanageability, then it is definitely time to seek help other than just willpower or just say no. Using money for sex that was needed to buy something else. One of the questions we will ask on our intake forms at workshops and when people come to group is, how much money have you spent on your addiction? And I can tell you that answers of $50,000 to $75,000 are pretty routine. We had a man who in 1 month alone dumped $75,000 into internet pornography. Had another over the course of his life talked about having spent over $250,000, and a Hollywood actor spent over $9 million. And if I called his name, all of you would know him, and you'd be amazed because he could have had any lady he wanted for free in all likelihood. But he was lining up prostitutes every hour on the hour, and he looked at us and said it was never, ever enough. Never enough to fill that hole that ultimately only God is going to be able to fill. But using money for sex that was needed for something else. Man I know in recovery who's now well over 20 years sober still talks with a little bit of shame about something that happened in his addiction. And that was that when he and his wife were struggling for money to buy formula. He spent a bunch of money on a prostitute. And though he is very well into his recovery and does a fantastic job with things today, that's still something he carries a little bit of shame over. But using money for sex, it's kind of the equivalent of drinking up the kids' college fund. And we're seeing inordinate amounts of money being blown on the sex trade. Lying about sex to someone that you love or to someone who trusts you. There's an old joke out there in addiction treatment. How do you know when an addict is lying? It's when their lips are moving. Addicts are going to be professional liars. And it doesn't matter how well educated you are, how well trained you are, how many degrees you can get. They can play their game better than you can yours. And when I'm training young therapists, I try to get that through to them. It's almost at times like watching amateur rescuers try to chase professional victims. But the lying is a fundamental part of any addiction. And in so many cases, they can fool you. But lying to anyone you love or to someone who trusts you. Using work time to be sexual. One of the things we have seen in recent years is a lot of lost productivity in corporate America. 70% of internet pornography is actually viewed between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. So what does that tell you? People are doing it at work. And it's a number of major corporations that have had to take disciplinary action against employees for sexual acting out on the job, different forms of sexual acting out. I'm thinking of a company that if I called the name, you all use its products. One lady who worked for them, 20 to 25-year employee, was one of their most productive employees, and they discovered she was arranging her business travel around affair partners in different cities. It didn't matter how long she'd been with the company or how effective she was out of a job that day. We saw here in the Atlanta area a couple of years ago where I believe it was the Fulton County Sheriff's Department was actually busted for this, with office staff deputies watching internet pornography on taxpayer dollars. And so there is a lot of lost productivity that comes from the use of pornography and other forms of sexual acting out in the workplace. So using work time to be sexual. Pretending to be someone other than who you are in order to be sexual. Now this is something that the internet has made possible. You can go online, create a profile. You can be a man and say you're a woman. You can be a woman and say you're a man. You can create any kind of fantasy identity that you want, and it may not be real. And we have seen situations where someone will go into a chat room, create an identity, interact with someone who's created an identity, and when the two people show up to meet face to face, one may be the opposite sex, and you can get into all kinds of crazy situations, some of which are very high risk, very dangerous. But pretending to be someone other than who you are in order to be sexual. Doing something sexual despite the threat of being caught. Sex addicts have tendencies towards high-risk behavior, and they end up needing to create more and more excitement to get the same high. They build up a tolerance neurochemically to it that goes. It's like the first time you drink that glass of wine. You get a good little buzz off of it. Keep drinking that wine every day for a few weeks. Eventually, it's going to take 3 times as much to get the same buzz. Well, it's the same with pornography. And so it has not been uncommon for us to hear stories of people who will binge 10, 12 hours at a time. Some of those binges going 3 or 4 days at a time. And they can actually have some of the withdrawal symptoms that go with that. But that tendency towards high-risk behavior. One man I worked with a while back, he came into me, the first time I'd met him, and he was sharing with me how acting out with prostitutes in a hotel room wasn't exciting enough. And so what he had begun to do was act out with prostitutes in the hallways of the hotel.